to be the host of today's session. You'll be seeing me, no doubt, throughout the rest of the day. But for now, I'm going to hand over to our first round of speakers. The theme of their session is towards an, is focused on climate finance to support adaptation of basic services and to build community resilience, a topic of real importance, I'm sure you will agree. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Patrick Moriarty. He is the CEO of IRC and will take over from here. Thank you.
In Glasgow and joining from other places around the world. It's a real pleasure to be here with you for this event. My name is Patrick Moriarty, and I'm the chair of the Sanitation and Water for All Steering Committee and the chief executive officer of one of its members, IRC Wash, an independent non-profit organisation that drives resilient wash systems from the ground up. So thank you for joining us today at this event, Climate Finance to Support Adaptation of Basic Services and Build Community Resilience, Water, Sanitation and Hygiene. And firstly, let me extend a very special welcome to the Honourable Minister of Lands, Agriculture, Fisheries, Water and Rural Development from Zimbabwe, Honourable Dr. A.J. Masuka. And on behalf of Sanitation Water for All, I would also like to thank all of our partners and co-conveners for this session. So that's water.org, UNICEF, and the governments of the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And thank you all for your support in helping us to organize this event. So I think I'm just going to talk us briefly through the agenda for the event. Hopefully you can, that's up on the slide, but basically we'll have this opening session. We're going to hear briefly from our Chief Executive Officer of Sanitation and Water for All, Katarina de Albuquerque. And then we'll go into a panel discussion moderated by Gary White from water.org. And I think we'll have about 25 minutes of that, and then followed by hopefully about 10 minutes Q&A. So as you're listening to that, I hope you all line your questions up, and then we'll have some closing remarks. So we've got about 45 minutes together, and I think it's going to be a really exciting and stimulating event. So look, we're all here this week, whether we're in person or virtually, because we know that decisive action to address climate change is urgent for the future of the planet, for ourselves, for our children. And while we have to continue and strengthen the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, we also need to recognize that for those in the most precarious situations, climate change is already happening and it's already impacting their lives and their livelihoods. So ensuring sustainable water and sanitation services is absolutely critical in this regard. I don't think I need to convince many of us here, but it's worth saying at the start. And why is it critical? It's critical because it's critical to building resilience, because these are essential services to households, to men, women, and children, but they're also fundamental to so many other services, and whether that's education or healthcare or just broad economic development. And yet, as we all know, investment in water, sanitation, and hygiene, including through climate finance, remains woefully inadequate. And I'd add that the political priority given to water, sanitation, and hygiene remains woefully adequate. So at today's event, we have an opportunity to reframe how we characterize these challenges. We should start by inverting the role of water, sanitation, hygiene in climate resilience and action. Too often, we hear about water, sanitation, and hygiene services being affected by changes in climate, by droughts or by floods or by hurricanes that damage these services. But today's conversation is about turning that around, about providing clear examples of how good and resilient water, sanitation, and hygiene underpin resilient livelihoods as part of a comprehensive resilience package. And so I think today we have three principal objectives. First, we want to highlight the cost benefits of building the resilience of infrastructure assets and basic social services such as water, sanitation and hygiene in low and middle income countries. And we do this by building the complementarities and synergies between water, food and energy. Secondly, we're emphasizing how climate resilience and water, sanitation and hygiene align with and feed into the broader climate rationale. And thirdly, we're describing new avenues, tangible ones, to team up and work with financiers and the private sector. So with this, I'm really excited to get the conversation started. And we're going to kick off now with a message from Katarina de Albuquerque, our Chief Executive Officer of Sanitation and Water for All. Over to you, Katarina.
Greetings to everyone. My name is Katarina Albuquerque and I'm the CEO of the Sanitation and Water for All Global Partnership, where we work to eliminate inequalities in the enjoyment of the human rights to water and sanitation in order to ensure universal access for everyone, always and everywhere until 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, if we look at the map of who still lacks access to safe drinking water, sanitation and hygiene, and as you know, it's billions of people around the world, we will still see that there is a considerable overlap with those communities who are most vulnerable to a variety of serious climate threats, such as prolonged droughts, floodings, and sea level rise. For us, it's clear that we cannot deliver on universal access to water, sanitation and hygiene without assuring accelerated action on climate change. In order to accelerate, sufficient resources must be devoted to this global challenge. However, the $100 billion a year committed that developed countries have promised to deliver on climate finance for developing countries has failed to materialize. We also see that private finance is not flowing to developing countries in the amounts that the world needs. And the money that is available is overwhelmingly directed towards mitigation to forestall increasingly worse impacts of climate change on our world. This is of course important, but equally important is the fact that those most vulnerable populations who I just mentioned, their lives, their livelihoods and their survival is impacted by climate change in the here and in the now, particularly in terms of access to water, sanitation and hygiene. Financing adaptation must be a priority if we are to respond to the needs of those in the most perilous circumstances. Currently, adaptation continues only to receive approximately 1/4 of total public climate finance. The unevenness is not only an issue of mitigation and adaptation. Within adaptation, there are also disparities. For instance, a recent WaterAid report revealed that an estimated 1/10 of climate finance for water-related projects is directed towards the adaptation needs for basic water, sanitation and hygiene, accounting for just 0.3% of total global climate finance. Ladies and gentlemen, water, sanitation and hygiene are, we all know it, an indispensable element of building climate resilient communities, particularly for those who are the most marginalized. As a matter of human rights, states must assess their overall available water resources, dwindling in many places as a result of climate change, as we know, and ensure that in prioritizing allocation of different water uses, the water needed for the realization of human rights, including the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, is the first need that is met.
We're going to explain how climate resilient WASH aligns with and feeds into broader climate rationale in countries, and discuss new avenues to team up the work with financiers and the private sector, as I mentioned. So we have a well-rounded group today. we'll have the Honorable Minister, Dr. Masuka, who was mentioned previously, Alejandro Jimenez, who's the Director of WASH at the Stockholm International Water Institute, Sam Godfrey, who's the WASH Advisor for UNICEF's Eastern and Southern Regional Office, and Kathleen Dominique, who is a finance lead for OECD's water program. So they'll each have 4 minutes to present, and then we'll go into the Q&A after that. So Dr. Masuka, I think you're ready. And in Zimbabwe, the government and key development partners are working on a climate proposal to the Green Climate Fund that makes emphasis on the complementarity and synergies of building food and water security. Now, can you please tell us more about how that initiative is unfolding?
Well, thank you very much for the strategic question, Chair. It is a great pleasure for me to be part of this session and to contribute to the important discussion on WASH and climate change financing. As you might be aware, in Zimbabwe, the primary challenge faced by vulnerable local communities in rural areas is limited access to water of sufficient quality and quantity to maintain food and water security. And climate change is exacerbating this challenge with rising temperatures and increasingly variable patterns of low rainfall, already impacting negatively on this sector. So climate change has contributed to the decline in diversity, in production, and in productivity in Zimbabwe, and I think across Southern Africa as well. And this has caused decreasing food availability to our households and leading to insufficient calorific and vitamin intake and contributing to malnutrition. And there is also a decrease in the food availability. But we need to look at water sanitation and hygiene differently. I think collectively the impact of decreasing availability of water in both agriculture and WASH sectors is compounding the existing socio-economic challenges that we see in Zimbabwe. The government of Zimbabwe has, however, made a start, and we are trying to build climate resilient and sustainable development, and the impacts we can see increasing poverty levels and reducing health and well-being of communities, particularly marginalized.
Dr. Masuka, would you like to turn your camera on? I don't know if you realize your camera's off.
Particularly marginalized groups such as women and the youth. While numerous actions have been taken by government and other entities to address these challenges, many have been implemented using the silo and centralized approaches. And there is therefore an urgent need to improve the cross-sectoral and decentralized management of water resources in Zimbabwe to ensure food and water security as part of a bigger plan to trigger climate resilient development. And as you might be aware, 70% of our population resides in communal areas. So the overall objective is to develop a GCF submission to strengthen the food and water security of vulnerable communities under changing climate conditions through an integrated water resources management approach. And this is a coordinated management of water, land, and other natural resources. This will be achieved simultaneously enhancing agricultural production through climate smart agriculture and maximizing the impacts of healthy food and healthy practices through improved water and sanitation services. And to ensure these services are climate resilient, they have to be adapted to the local risks. And then strengthening integrated water resource management in agriculture and the water sanitation and hygiene sectors will facilitate the enhanced socio-economic welfare of targeted communities and improve their capacities to adapt to climate change. And the government of Zimbabwe has already identified climate smart agriculture as a national priority for addressing the impacts of climate change on food production in the country. While this is crucial for improving food security and community resilience in Zimbabwe, water sanitation, hygiene service provision is equally important. And it is in this regard that we think that without enhancing WASH services, the benefits of food production will not be maximized. So the proposed approach will thus help shift adaptation strategies away from the business as usual silo approaches to a more integrated water resources management that incorporates cross-sectoral and inclusive decentralized approaches to community development. So the government of Zimbabwe is working with the FAO and collaborating with various other partners to develop this GCF proposal, which we hope will enhance WASH activities, climate smart agriculture, and above all, ensure that the communities, the 70% of our population, can be mainstreamed in the more resilient WASH and climate smart agriculture way. Thank you very much.
Dr. Masuda, thank you for that. That was a really great overview of kind of how you are really leaning into this issue, and we appreciate that. Now, to keep the pace up and stay on schedule, I want to bring in Alejandro Jimenez. Here, I see we have him on the screen. So, Alejandro, how is the WASH sector strengthening its capacity on issues that relate to climate change? Where do you think we are in terms of developing risk analysis, investment pipeline, and those other mechanisms that we're going to need to scale up finance?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to everyone. As short of time, I'll go straight to the point. From our side, we have been supporting over 15 countries this year with a number of aspects related to strengthening water and sanitation into climate, right? But for me, the first point would be to lay the policy foundations for climate finance. And what I mean by that is improving the climate policy landscape and how the climate policies are dealing with water issues, and also how water policies are dealing with climate aspects. It is of crucial importance this year, the work on the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, to see how water and sanitation elements can be brought into those commitments, as well as in the national adaptation plans. This policy landscape is going to help us to have the good entry points to then develop more concrete proposals moving forward. That is one element. Another element is to place this into the climate finance analysis for the country. What is being financed by whom, what kind of projects, where, the different mechanisms, what are the agencies that are accredited, how do they coordinate with each other, where do we find the gaps? And that is then another element. And all these help us then to work on that very famous climate rationale, right? How the countries conduct a risk analysis, seeing what are the climate risks that affecting the various, how it can be done good options appraisal to see which are the interventions that can help mitigate the risk in the best possible way. So from our side, we have been working along these lines, and what we can see so far is that the new wave of policy documents, particularly national determined contributions that have been presented these days, will see a greater presence of water compared to the previous round. Then the challenge is how do we make this turn into concrete finance and concrete avenues of funds for projects at the country level. And I think with this, I can hand over to you and next speakers, which will give us a few more examples about this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alejandro. Well said. A nice segue into Sam Godfrey. So, Sam, how has the water sector been exploring avenues to team up with new types of financiers and the private sector?
Thank you very much, Gary, and good afternoon from Nairobi. As you know, the UNICEF Global Strategic Plan has placed climate resilient WASH as a central change strategy. And here in Eastern Southern Africa, we've undertaken a fiscal analysis which reveals that we require around $15 billion annually till 2030 to meet the WASH SDG 6.1 and 6.2 targets across the 21 countries in Eastern Southern Africa. And interestingly, of that, 10 billion of it is for basic service level provision, and 5 billion of it is for climate resilience, so the actual adaptation that's needed for the technology. So the first thing I just wanted to focus on in my brief intervention is, what really makes a climate resilient water supply more expensive? What are the components? And I would say that there are really 3 components which are important for the financing. The first of them really is securing that sustainable water resource that was mentioned by a previous speaker. And many of that in the context of East and Southern Africa needs water transversal schemes, moving water from one side of a district or a province to another, and even exploring deeper and rechargeable groundwater supplies to be able to extract groundwater that's sustainable throughout droughts and floods. The second is really the investment in material quality and innovation. As we know, many of the water systems that are built across the East and Southern Africa region are using HDPE plastic tanks, which, as we know, are very prone to distortion, material distortion, due to the increased temperatures and the PV intensity. And there's a need to replace them with steel and steel water tanks. And the third is really the integration of renewable energy in water innovations, such as, for example, biosensors, to manage the quantity and quality of those systems, and also to reduce, of course, the overall CO2 footprint. So to achieve these, of course, we need various partners. And one of the key things that we've been focusing on here in East and Southern Africa is how can we involve the private sector as a partner and a financier in the elaboration of these types of climate resilient water supply projects. And I think the first experience that we've had with this is that we have tried to identify key DFIs, so DFIs that are locally putting in commercial finance to the water and sanitation sector. And in 2019, we established a memorandum of understanding with the Development Bank of Southern Africa to elaborate a project pipeline where the project pipelines would be submitted to the Green Climate Fund by the DBSA with UNICEF as an implementing entity through its country office programs. That particular pipeline of projects, of course, then needed to have a variety of different partners engaged. And to date, we've developed 5 different country submissions, including contributions to the submission mentioned by the Honourable Minister from Zimbabwe. But for those submissions to work and those to be financed, particularly by the Green Climate Fund, there is often a need to integrate the private sector into the concept development. So in 2020, we launched actually a market assessment to try to identify private sector partners who could contribute financially and technically to climate adaptation projects within this pipeline. And the request for proposal was completed and 2 companies were actually selected. And these 2 companies were then assigned particular countries within the region to concept proof both the material and the technology innovations through essentially a form of de-risking, where they were able to place their own finance behind the actual business plans that were developed for the project pipeline, which enabled us, of course, to then submit specific projects through the Development Bank of Southern Africa to the Green Climate Fund. So just to finish then, going forward, I think one recommendation from our side here in Nairobi is that in order for climate finance to work at scale, we really need, during the COP, a discussion around multi-country climate finance submissions. Water, of course, as we know, is transboundary in nature, and its management is not dependent, of course, on one individual NDA. It does depend on multiple countries and multiple NDAs. And we feel it's very important that coming out of the discussions on financing, there is a recognition that we need to have multi-country proposals which will enable us to deliver climate finance in WASH at scale. Thanks very much, Gary.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate that. And we're going to move right along so that we have time for some Q&A. So Kathleen, so we've discussed a lot already. And what would you say is the OECD's advice to the sector to strike this right balance between adaptation and mitigation? And, coming off the September meeting roundtable, I think that you had with OECD, any new insights there to share?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary, and greetings to everyone. And thanks so much to the organizers. This is a really timely discussion and Very happy to be here. A couple of really key, clear messages that came from the roundtable that we had in September was that there are many, many ways that financing for water security, including WASH, contributes to climate action. That's adaptation, resilience, but also mitigation, which gets a lot less attention. The roundtable also highlighted the need for both more climate finance for water. So we've heard some statistics about that, and that those allocations remain pretty modest, but also more financing for water that contributes to climate action. So any of the financing that's flowing into those systems really should be linking to and being explicit about how they're contributing to climate action. In terms of the financing opportunities, especially to some examples, a lot of practical examples shared at the roundtable meeting, we see several. So one is tapping into opportunities to mobilize finance through that increasing strategic focus on climate action from governments, development banks, dedicated climate funds. That can be a big opportunity for water. It can also be a bit of a risk. That requires that those working on WASH and water continue to make strong linkages to show explicitly how those investments contribute to climate action and how financing WASH aligns with Paris as that gets the Paris Agreement, as that gets more and more political attention. Still, on that front, there's a lot to be done. As mentioned, the 100 billion target for climate finance has not been met. That's the commitment from developed countries to developing countries. The latest OECD estimates highlight that goal will probably not be reached until 2023. Also, we know that only about 1 in 4 of those dollars is going to adaptation, and there's a need to reallocate the financing to put adaptation financing on par with a government's commitments to put adaptation on par with mitigation, but also importantly to lower barriers to dedicated climate finance and practical approaches to aligning finance with Paris. Now, Gary, you mentioned at the very beginning ways to look for new opportunities from the bottom up, and we saw that also at the roundtable meeting, looking for ways to generate new revenue streams, for example, through blue carbon credit markets, using insurance and risk financing approaches, attracting new types of financiers who are looking for environmental and climate-related opportunities, for example, through use of proceeds bonds. We had many new and emerging initiatives shared at the roundtable, including Climate Investor 2, that's a blended fund, forest resilience bonds to deal with wildfire risk, environmental impact bonds for water. And then we also see development partners like USAID making very targeted investments in cost savings, WASH efficiency improvements, and making the case about how this contributes to climate action. Let me just say one last point before I close, because for many developing countries, notably the LDCs, financing needs and challenges are really significant, and the opportunities to mobilize private finance are more limited. And here, scaling up the development financing flows is really crucial. And I just want to highlight one important announcement, a declaration that was made from the OECD Development Assistance Committee members just a few days ago. And they have committed now to ensure that all development cooperation, all development finance, which totaled 161 billion last year, will be aligned with the Paris Agreement. And that declaration includes a number of key commitments. I'll just highlight 2. One is further prioritizing adaptation needs of developing countries, including LDCs and small island developing states, and increasing finance for adaptation, as well as reducing barriers to accessing that finance. So that's an important commitment, that's an important announcement, and what will be important is to see how that actually changes the situation on the ground.
Great, thanks, Kathleen, for some of those concrete examples of what's happening with OECD. So now we are into the Q&A session, and I don't know that we've had any questions submitted so far. Okay, so I just verified no questions so far. I'll throw one out while we're waiting to see if any of those questions do come in. So if we talk about meeting people halfway, what do the panelists see as a potential to use investment for wash services that impact the base of the pyramid, but also generate carbon credits or carbon offsets. So we know that the current infrastructure is in a miserable condition. I read a statistic the other day, like something like 4 trillion gallons of water are lost or unaccounted for in the water sector globally, representing about 25% of all the water in the system. It seems like there's a massive, massive carbon footprint associated with those water losses that provide no economic good. What do you see as a potential of, as we invest in infrastructure, capturing the carbon offsets and selling those in like a market that is like very short on supply for carbon offsets right now? Does anyone want to explain how we can do that and get certified?
Gary, if you'd like, I can jump in.
Sure.
Just because we see that, some attempts to do this, and oftentimes that's looking at the full water system. So you mentioned reducing non-revenue water, which is really important, right? Improving efficiency of the delivery of services. That saves energy costs. Obviously, that reduces emissions vis-a-vis the baseline. I think another example that we see as well, folks who are working on, for example, water funds, so upstream of water systems, we've heard that already a couple of times, the importance of looking at that full picture and looking at securing water supplies. So water funds are a financing approach to protect upstream catchment management and making sure that you have secure supply. That's very important for resilient wash systems. And we see some, interesting emerging examples of where those water funds are looking to quantify their activities in terms of reduced emissions and being able to then use that quantification to be certified and then accessing additional revenue from carbon offsets. So that's, I would say, so far an emerging approach. It hasn't been completely mainstreamed. And of course, there are some issues related to making sure that there's scientific credibility behind that offsetting scheme. But we think that's a very interesting approach to explore as well.
Great, thanks.
Well, thank you. In Zimbabwe, in some of our cities, we lose up to 40% of the treated water through conveyancing systems that are all dilapidated. And therefore, any saving that can be generated from there would mean that we'll be able to reach more people and improve, but we also reduce the cost of pumping. And once we've done that, the wastewater that we generate, we just let that flow again. And I think that there are opportunities where we could try and utilize that more efficiently and improve our footprint. I also see an opportunity in most of our rural communities where the conveyancing systems, wherever they exist, are very inefficient. They could actually be motivation for communities to look after their catchments, their wetlands much better if we had systems that are able to capture the water more efficiently and be able to distribute it in a more healthy manner. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Masuka. So that does bring us to the end. I wanted to hand it back over to Patrick. I think, just to summarize, we're looking working with water resources and food and energy sectors on this issue. That's important. The WASH sector is building this climate rationale, I think, for strong proposals. And that, I think, will lead to more financing. And it's important to find, actionable things. Things are tangible so that we can have bankable deals, if you will, for financiers and the private sector to come in. So those are all kind of my takeaways. And Patrick, back over to you. Thank you.
Great. And thank you very much, Gary. And thank you all of our panelists. I think this was a really great kickoff to the WASH and Finance Day, Water and Finance Day. I mean, I just like to make 3 quick points in closing on behalf of Sanitation and Water for All, and which I think were very much underpinned by what we heard. Yeah, one is that investing in climate resilient water, sanitation and hygiene services is a key part of the solution to the global climate crisis, right? It provides an opportunity to policymakers and service providers to rethink access to basic services, to adhere to circular economy and green growth principles. And I think it also helps us to address perennial challenges in water and sanitation, particularly sustainability. And two, there are important and to date largely untapped opportunities around mitigation by improving water and energy efficiency, by ensuring where possible the use of renewable energy for water and sanitation operations, and also real opportunities to cut the greenhouse gas emissions related to wastewater, as we've just been hearing, in excreta disposal, by choosing appropriate types of sanitation and treatment processes. And then thirdly, that as we've seen and discussed during the session, the water, sanitation and hygiene sector is able and should team up with other sectors, as well as with financiers, to make itself attractive to financiers, to work with other sectors, to build the adaptive capacity and resilience that's going to be necessary, whatever we manage to do on the mitigation front. And surely if we can find and tap into such collaborative spirit, we can mobilize the necessary climate finance to achieve the Paris goal of mobilizing the 100 billion a year that Kathleen mentioned, and more importantly, to address the pressing mitigation and most importantly, I'd say, adaptation needs of developing countries. Together we can do it. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your days wherever you are. Thank you.
I grew up in East Texas, born and raised. I've lived here for the last 52 years on the banks of the lake. As a kid, I just thought it was a place to hunt and fish. It was just a tool to use. It was my backyard. It's where I grew up and I played. As I got older, I started to appreciate the birds, the fish, the different animals that make up this ecosystem, and the rises and falls of water. I started to realize what was happening when we got droughts, when we got floods, and how it all worked together to create this ecosystem. Nature needs certain times of year, certain flows, sometimes high water, sometimes low water, to disperse seeds, to trigger fish to spawn. In the 1940s, there were quite a few devastating floods in and around Texas, so there was a lot of dam building that went on in the 50s. There are three primary tributaries to Caddo Lake. Big Cypress is the biggest one and was one of the areas that was impounded to control some dangerous flooding, but they operated it so they would keep a steady level at Caddo.
It wasn't immediately obvious what was going on, but over time there was a lot of die-off of trees. Fish that were here disappeared. Wetlands were no longer connected to one another. The overall system just wasn't functioning. It's not practical to remove this dam. There would be too much damage to historic towns and population centers, but by tweaking the way they're operated, we can make sure we're balancing the needs of nature with the needs of people. If we can try to recreate Mother Nature within the limits of the dam, what would that look like? What would it take to keep the forest healthy, to try and see more of these specialized fish that should be here, to get them back?
In this case, we're using the dam more as a tool to put some degree of function back in place. The Corps of Engineers staff took a look at how they operate the dam and looked at our flow recommendations. They adopted a change to work in these flows. What we're seeing out here may not look like much, but this is actually the result of what the Corps of Engineers releasing our prescriptions looks like. Just like a doctor prescribing just what the patient needs. Now, this is what the river needs. Not only has the Corps been releasing these flows, but we've actually put in place the science to see if the ecosystem is responding to that. With even some small changes to how the flows are